but I wonder what Jonathan Sacerdoti thinks. He's a journalist and broadcaster who has an outstanding article on the Spectator website today. The headline is "The Washington Shooting is a Chilling Warning to Jews Everywhere." Jonathan, even by your usual standards, this was an absolutely superb article. I'm going to tweet it out in the next break, and I want people to go on my Twitter at Peter Cardwell and have a read of it. There are loads of things that you raise, and I want to talk through those, Jonathan. But first of all, I want your reaction to Gideon Sa'ar, because I was just looking at the different timings, even just a really straightforward thing on the different timings. Simon Harris, the Taoiseach in Ireland, condemned what happened in Washington at 7:10 this morning with a tweet. Emmanuel Macron condemning what happened in Washington, 9:48 a.m. Keir Starmer's first tweet was about returning 30,000 people after the election, 12% more than the last government. It took him until this afternoon to actually tweet about what happened in Washington. And many people will notice that, many people will see that. And as your article brilliantly points out, it's sometimes those subtle things, the Jewish people often the frog in the pot in regard to anti-Semitism and in regard to what is happening in our society. Tell me your thoughts today, Jonathan.
Well, firstly, thank you for your kind words about the article. And, you know, it's always flattering when people do tell me that something I wrote resonated. But I must say, it's really depressing that I find now cause to write so often on these sorts of topics. And that's where that piece came from. It really came from deep in my heart or in my soul. It's my inner being. It's everything I'm on this planet to do as a journalist. And I don't mean to sound too grand saying stuff like that, because ultimately, I'm sitting writing things that I and many other Jewish people are thinking. And all I can say is nothing about this shooting was a surprise, because I, like the Foreign Minister of Israel there, have seen this coming, not just for months, as he said, actually for years. This constant drip, drip, drip of anti-Israel propaganda put out by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, but so readily adopted by the left-wing media, the mainstream media in general. Governments can't just blame the Labour government we have now. Even David Cameron, when he was Foreign Secretary, and in years before that, said outrageous things about Israel and the conflict with the Palestinians. This is just something that really has to end, because this is the logical consequence of what happens if you constantly tell a whole new generation of people who don't know very much about the history and the conflict that Israel, the Jewish state, effectively Jews, are Nazis, are killing babies for sport, for hobby, for fun, that they are starving people deliberately to try and torture them. All of these lies, all of these blood libels, all of these calumnies about the Jewish state and Jews will, of course, lead people to carrying out violence on Jews. And it's so important that we can say they're not true. They're lies. They're deliberate lies. And people are either spreading them intentionally, or they are moronically spreading them because they think it will get them off the hook from the same enemy, or because they simply don't know better. But none of those excuses are good enough when we end up with people being killed in this way yet again.
What I'd really like my fellow journalists to do, what I'd really like them to do, is just apply the same standards to Jewish people and to Israel as they do to other nations. So I wouldn't trust Wikipedia, for example. So I check everything that I put on air that I've seen on Wikipedia. I go to the source and make sure it's correct. That's basic journalism. It would be really good if people said Hamas are telling us what these figures of deaths are in Gaza. I'm not saying for a second that people aren't dying in Gaza. I'm not saying that there's not a humanitarian crisis there. Of course there is. But when it comes to words like genocide, for example, as you say in your article, which is thrown around, it was thrown around by Trump yesterday in regard to South Africa, it's been thrown around by many, many people in regard to what Israel is doing. And actually, I'm actually just going to read this paragraph from your article. The virus is spread throughout the media and into ordinary society. Consider this week's now infamous claim that 14,000 babies in Gaza were at imminent risk of death by starvation within 2 days, a figure so implausible, so grotesquely inflated that it should have collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. And yet it didn't. Major news outlets repeated it. Activists shouted it, shared it as gospel, as if numbers so apocalyptic required no scrutiny at all. That number, as you know far better than I do, Jonathan, did not come from Hamas. It came from the United Nations.
It's true. And when you try and explain to a wider population who aren't interested necessarily in this topic or don't know a lot about it, they assume, understandably, that something called the United Nations, something with that mission, is this purer than pure, whiter than white, dedicated to humanitarian cause and not at all polluted by politics, supranational organisation. But it's not true. If you just think about which nations are united in it, so many of them are not democracies. So many of them stated aims against countries like Israel, against other democracies. So many of them openly hate Jewish people. So it's not really a fair arbiter of anything. And when it puts out such outrageous claims as that and has spokespeople or people high up in that organisation say those things out on the airwaves, it isn't enough just to say, well, I heard the UN say it. Too often, the UN is relying on corrupted bodies on the ground in Gaza, for example. Too often, there is speculation, and it's then twisted and misrepresented even by their own people. Each one of us has the ability for critical thinking. Everyone listening or watching this right now has the ability for critical thinking. Every journalist has not just the ability, but the responsibility for critical thinking. And sure, we can all make mistakes. We can all get sources wrong. But 14,000 babies dying in the next 2 days from this overblown claim of famine and starvation, which is inaccurate. Yes, it's correct to say that in this brutal and complex war zone, there may be some issues of shortage and need, there may even be some hunger, but there is very little conclusive proof of that being widespread, of that causing anything like the disaster that was being predicted there, and certainly not in that time frame. And I would say that any journalist that picked up that number and ran with it, and any independent citizen who literally did not have their head screwed on, because it was such a stupid and outrageous claim. It was so obviously wrong, and even the UN then reeled it back, and it was revealed that they were talking about what could happen with signs of hunger within a year if the current levels were the same or got worse. That's a very different prospect, and even that is dubious, but a very different prospect from what they put out there. I really think that people need to get real. They need to get over themselves. They need to get over these lies, these misrepresentations. And I say it with the utmost seriousness. It's time. It's time. It's been 80 years since the last time there was this mechanized and international attempt to wipe out Jews. But for many of us, it really does truly feel like something horribly sinister is starting again. And I said in that article, and I'll say it here, you know, if we're looking to stop the next version of what happened back then in my father's youth, then we need not look for swastikas and jackboots. We need to look for the modern day representations, the modern day little symbols in ordinary society, the people we live among, the people we live next to, the things they're permitting, the things they're maybe even doing, which are actually facilitating this rising wave of hatred against Jews. And it goes from the ground, from the street upwards, into schools, into classrooms, into medical clinics, into the BBC, into other news broadcasters, other news outlets, Sky News, all of these places. They need to look at what they're doing. This is serious. Okay. It's not a game, and it's not about getting scoops and making big stories. It's about real lives and what they're doing to put Jewish people at risk.
What would you say to those who cite things such as the words of the Israeli finance minister, for example, talking about cleansing Gaza? I support the Israeli people. I do not support the Israeli government and a lot of what it is doing, although some of it I do support. There are some people who think, and I've been guilty of it myself, of thinking that sometimes the Israeli government is its own worst enemy in some of the things it says and some of the things it does. It can be a difficult dance for people to continue to support the Israeli people when sometimes those things are thrown in our face and we see some of the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Gaza. How would you tackle that issue, Jonathan?
I think there's a few things to separate out there, and I know that in programmes like this time is short, so I'll do my best. I'll say that all democratic governments, and Israel is a healthy democracy, some might say too healthy and too democratic, it will have people that say stupid things, even in power, even in cabinets. Our own country provides plenty of examples of that. Our own Foreign Secretary, in my opinion, it has provided plenty in the last few days, and morally reprehensible and inexcusable things that he said, particularly about Israel. And I will say also that that not everything that every politician says is correct, but similarly, not everything that every Israeli politician says, even in high-up positions in the cabinet, because of their coalition system, is necessarily actually the policy that's put into action during the war. So what's going on in Gaza is not necessarily reflected by even those most outrageous statements that you could find from some of the most extreme people in the Israeli government. Now, that's not me excusing the things they say, but it is me saying, look for what's actually happening. And I will say that there is, as far as I can see, no evidence of this sort of mass cleansing, this sinister plot to try to wipe out children, targeting of civilians. All of those things are untrue. It's difficult for us to prove them because there are doubts over numbers that come out from Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and there is no way for most journalists to get in. I accept all of those things, but that doesn't mean that we can just run with the lies of the terrorists and make things up, especially when those things often seem to fall in the line of blood libels and calumnies about Jewish people and Israel, which only feed the worst instincts that some people have because they've been primed for this stuff for decades. So I would say that all of those things are important to keep in mind.
And I do think the Israeli government and the Egyptian government actually should change their mind and should let journalists into Gaza so they can do independent reporting. Priti Patel has told our colleagues on Times Radio, she's of course the Shadow Foreign Secretary, she believes the UK's joint statement with France and Canada about Israel's conduct in the war against Hamas was completely unhelpful and provoked a reaction from a terrorist organisation, referring to the killing of 2 Israeli diplomats in Washington DC. That's just happened in the last few minutes over on Times Radio. Our colleagues there reporting that. Jonathan, what do you make of Priti Patel's comments?
Listen, Priti Patel's often had her head screwed on quite right about matters to do with Israel, and I'm perfectly happy to say that, because I think that unfortunately politicians in this country who are willing to think straight and then say it out loud are actually quite rare. I can't necessarily tell you if the killer in DC was literally part of a terror group or anything like that, but it seems fairly obvious from what we're starting to learn about him that he was a well-seasoned, signed-up member of some far-left organisations and groups in the US, and that, you know, those phrases that came out of his mouth that we heard him shout and that eyewitnesses reported, free Palestine and Intifada, as he was led away, having killed those 2 people outside the Jewish Museum, he didn't make those phrases up. I've heard them week in, week out in this country, on our streets, even on our television screens projected onto Big Ben from the river to the sea. All of these things are leading towards what we saw there. And let me say, it didn't take October the 7th, and it didn't even take the last 18 months of these so-called hate marches to bring it about. Jews were killed outside the Jewish Museum in Brussels some years ago. Jews were held hostage and killed in the Hypercacher supermarket in France. I reported from there. Jews are being killed all over Europe for many years. Jews have been shot in a Jewish school in Toulouse not that many years ago. Jews are still the targets for Islamic terrorism. And what is so tragic is that the far left has made this unholy alliance with Jews, and that you will find people that are so committed to these so-called social justice causes, who are so dedicated to signalling what they consider to be their virtue in looking out for these so-called human rights abuses, which simply are over-exaggerated or not happening at all. And all of this feels so conveniently like it can be fit right onto Israel, the Jewish state. I'm sorry, so many Jewish people in this country, and I really urge people who maybe don't agree with me just to listen to it and hear it. I don't often sound this urgent or depressed or miserable about this stuff, but I get written to by Jews every single day because of the pieces I write and because of the broadcasts I do. I hear from such a wide range of people around the world. Some do disagree with me, but the vast majority, Jewish and non-Jewish, write to me quietly and say, I hear what you're saying, this is utterly depressing. The world needs to wake up. The world needs to do something about this, and we are right there with you. If this is true, that there is a silent majority who agree with what I'm saying and with what Jewish people are feeling, it's time they stop being silent. It's time every Jew stop being silent, every non-Jew stop being silent. We have to speak up against this because too many people are dying, and there is too much of this going on year after year after year.
Jonathan, thank you. That's Jonathan Sacerdoti, journalist and broadcaster. And one of the things you can do, whether you're Jewish or not, is go to my Twitter at Peter Cardwell. In the next couple of minutes during the break, I'm going to tweet Jonathan's article. Read it, like it, retweet it, make sure that the people who follow you on Twitter read it too, because it is a really important piece of journalism on a really dark day in regard to what happened in Washington, D.C. We're not forgetting for a second the incredible humanitarian crisis there is in Gaza. It needs to be solved. The Jewish people around the world and Israeli people in Israel need our support too. They're under attack. I actually got a direct message from someone on Twitter who's there talking about a rocket attack at 3 o'clock in the morning where she is. There's so much to this, and we need to make sure we're informed, and as Jonathan correctly says, that we engage our critical faculties. Get the facts, then make a decision.